And so, yeah, we want to discuss sort of the. I don't know if you want to touch upon the histories of the G7 and then BRICS or BRICS plus. I definitely want to talk about the way, maybe a little bit, in which Russia was kicked out in a very virtue signaled way in 2014 as a result of basically reacquiring Crimea after a popular referendum. And of course, interestingly enough, none of the G7 countries sanctioned each other or kicked each other out during any of the previous wars, actual wars, like, Iraq being the most obvious example, or any of the other ones since this organization first came to be. So if you could start maybe with a little bit of history for each of the two, you don't have to go into too much detail. And then we want to bring it to the present day and maybe talk about some of these economic forecasts and talk about the way that these two organizations are usually pitted against each other, and perhaps for good reason, or maybe not.
Well, thank you very much. Beginning with G7, because it's older than BRICS, very shortly, it's one of those international structures that belongs to, in my opinion, a kind of dead world, in the sense that it was born in the context of the Cold War, also in the context of the development of neoliberalism. The 70s was the time when neoliberalism was beginning to implant itself in the economies of a lot of countries. It became basically the the economic rule during the 90s, but during the 70s and the 80s, it was already being discussed at first Anglo-Saxon countries and even Latin American countries, with Chile, for example. But little by little, from the G7, from the 70s onwards, it began to seep into the social fabric, political fabric of the other countries, like Germany and France and Japan and the other countries, of course, not only of G7. The major principle or the axis around G7 works. It's basically the building of a world market economy with as little as barriers and protection as possible. And in this sense, G7 is part of a constellation of other international institutions that work basically towards building what we understand as a kind of a global structure that, well, conspiracy theorists would call New World Order, or we could refer to it as globalism, but we don't need to make use of conspiracy theories to understand all this process, because it's basically an attempt at managing the expansion of globalization and the destruction of all kinds of frontiers, barriers to the flow of persons, to the flow of capital, to the flow of goods. It coincides, for example, it isn't a coincidence that we see the growth of migration towards Europe, for example, from the 70s onwards, and also the invasion of Europe by US products, by Coca-Cola, McDonald's, etc., because it's basically an attempt at integrating these countries first in this global society, global market, and then irradiating from the G7 to other less developed countries these same principles, market principles, liberal principles. Eventually, Russia was accepted at the club. And why was Russia accepted at the club? Because in the West, there have been basically two views of Russia. We could call it a distinction between Kissinger and Brzezinski. Those who follow Brzezinski ideas, as a matter of fact, want to impose an eternal siege, an eternal military and political diplomatic siege against Russia until it breaks up. And those who follow the principles of Henry Kissinger, recently deceased, they have another kind of approach, a softer approach that would see Russia being slowly integrated into the West, but we could sum it up as an exchange of its soul, because all these attempts at integrating Russia into the West, with the collaboration of those who we could call the sixth column or the fifth column of the Russian oligarchs and liberals, it's basically an attempt at westernizing Russia, turn Russia as close to as a Western market economy as possible. And that's why Russia was accepted into G7 and it became G8 until, as Nina, as a matter of fact, already said, Russia was suspended and never came back. As a matter of fact, it was expelled because it's an eternal suspension is an expulsion because of the situation in Crimea, of the reintegration of Crimea in 2014. And but well, jumping already to modern times, to current times, of course, we can't discount the importance of G7. It's very obvious because it is still a group of countries that is responsible for more or less a third of the world GDP, a big part of the world's wealth generation. But as a matter of fact, if we take a look at what's been happening with the G7 countries, especially in the last 2 years, well, we just need to take a look at Germany, for example. I'd say that Germany is the clearest example of the, at least, stagnation, or as a matter of fact, decadence of this model of development, because we've had already for car plants from Volkswagen and Audi closing. We've had yesterday, if I'm correct, ThyssenKrupp's plants closing also, with all of that together, 100 or 200 people jobless in Germany, and that's rare for German economy since the end of the Second World War. If we are talking about West Germany, and in general, if we are talking about Germany, we haven't seen anything like that before since the end of the Cold War, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And Germany isn't creating new jobs. It isn't a situation where Germany is closing a sector to open another sector, because, well, we have this process where old school Fordist capitalism is being overcome by a fourth industrial capitalism, or whatever we can call it, where it's more focused on high technology, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, etc. But nothing of that is happening in Germany, as a matter of fact. Countries where these new developments in capitalism is happening are the Asian countries, mostly China, South Korea still, Taiwan, though it's part of China, a bit China, a bit Japan, and other southeastern Asian countries, and still the United States, because of course they have enough capital to invest in these new developments. But the problem is not only in Germany, though the German case, of course, is the most blatant because it's the most unusual. In France, we have public debt, huge public debt. Even some bureaucrats in the European Union are talking about imposing some small sanctions against France because of Macron's inability to control this debt. And then they are talking again in France about a new pension reform, though they've had a pension reform 2 years ago. I don't know. France seems to be doing pension reforms and labor reforms every 2 years because they have been unable to control their own budget. And why? Because the economic model of the G7 countries, which is neoliberalism, has been unable to guarantee growth. And if they don't guarantee growth, they need to begin making budget cuts that always are in health services, education services, and other public services or public or common good services. And this is basically the tendency. In Japan, for example, we have the problem of the demographic problem, which is also, of course, it's more radical in Japan, but it's the same problem that European countries also have. And well, Canada and the US can only avert it basically through mass migration, which represents another kind of problem. And because all of that is ideologically integrated, also in Japan, they are talking about opening Japan to mass migration, which will basically bring the same problems that Europeans and North Americans are having to Japan. And I actually think the Japanese aren't the least prepared to the problems of mass migration. We already see many videos on the internet about some strange stuff that happened in public spaces in Japan because of excessive tourism, for example, and also because of the small amounts of migration that they are already receiving. And basically, that's the scenario we see in the G7 countries nowadays. Basically, economic stagnation in most countries, mass migration, the inability to guarantee economic growth. When these countries grow, it's 1 or 2% a year, usually not enough to accommodate for the needs of the people. The high cost of living because of the sanctions against Russia and because of energy problems, energetic problems, and these attempts at energy transition to impose a green agenda which affects farmers in the G7 countries, farmers in France especially, but also in the United Kingdom, in Germany, more during the beginning of the year, and other G7 countries have been protesting. We saw the situation with the truck drivers in Canada some time ago. These sectors of the economy, which are connected to farming and logistics, because logistics is connected to farming as the way that goods are transported from inner towns and the rural sector to the cities and also to the ports for exports. And that's the scenario with the G7, as a matter of fact. And well,
let me ask you a couple of questions. I think this was a great summary of history going into the present day. To what extent would Germany still be experiencing such significant problems if it were not for deliberately cutting off Germans' access to cheap Russian energy? Because it seems like that was a huge part of the so-called German economic miracle. And yes, of course, there are other things that are happening that are part of the sort of broader system that I think you described very well. But it seems that because of that particular issue, Germany is such an outlier where all of these kind of more traditional industrial sectors like the car sector that you mentioned are impacted the most. So do you think Germany would have stagnated quite as much if it weren't for deliberately cutting cheap Russian energy?
Not quite as much. We see, for example, that France, we can't say that it's faring good currently, but it isn't in the same situation, the same decadent economic situation as Germany, because they have invested on nuclear power. And Germans, with though it's usually a very smart people, they have basically decided to close all their nuclear power plants to go for this utopian idea of energy transition, green energy, etc. And well,
Green
they could
coal.
manage,
And
yes,
coal. Coal.
and now coal, as a matter of fact. Well, they could maybe do this energy transition little by little if they had access to cheap Russian gas, which they used to have. And the fact that the German government, didn't do anything, even after what happened, it was the most cooked thing I have ever seen in politics. It was so sad, you know. It was
Pathetic.
pathetic. Yes, it was sad to see a chancellor of Germany just accepting what happened and keeping this company, keeping basically towing the line of the West. And but no, it would still be somewhat stagnant because it's the situation, it's the context of neoliberal Western economy nowadays. Though usually Germany compensates through sub-imperialism in European countries, where they guarantee very beneficial agreements with the poorer countries of the European Union, like Portugal, and Greece and Romania, Bulgaria, etc., so that German businesses can enter these countries to extract capital and basically take down competition in these countries. But now it's unable to do that because of the lack of access to cheap energy, and of course solar power and wind power, and even the coal power plants can't compensate for the lack of cheap Russian gas. And that's also why some of these businesses are going to the United States. So it's ridiculous because
Or China.
or China, yes. But the idea in the United States is to attract these German companies, and I think under Trump, it's going to be even more clear how the situation with Germany is bad, because I don't think Trump will have any kind of sympathy for the German plight, and he will keep trying to attract these German companies to the United States.
It's as if the whole situation with Nord Stream was deliberate to exert greater control over what's left of Europe, and of course to separate Russia from this market. What I'd like you to talk
Who
about
would
is
imagine that?
I know.
Just to jump in just a second, it's I had this kind of insight the other day. You were mentioning the fourth industrial revolution with AI and all that, and I some time ago in a live stream I was talking. I don't remember with whom. I think Hugo Dionisio, and we were talking about the industrial revolution in the United States, where the United States held basically 60% of all the productions in the 50s and 60s, more or less, 60% of all industrial production of the planet. And we were talking about China, and we were saying, yeah, we probably won't see that again in the world, because the countries are now rising rapidly, more rapidly. And then I saw some interesting graph or plots from artificial intelligence being used and produced in China, and it was astonishing. The amount the Chinese artificial intelligence products and subproducts and use was so ahead of the rest of the planet that I was like, well, perhaps we are going to see something even in a bigger scale than we saw in the middle 20th century in the United States. But and in the other hand, it looks like the West are still believes that they hold they are the only one that holds the technology for chips and electronics, basically. And well, they are still the most advanced at the moment, but China is growing also very fast. And also Russia now is producing. They are very behind on that, but they're getting there. And I think that once they understood that they have to have their own production, they're going to go ahead quicker and faster than, well, it took the West to arrive in this position, because the technology is now known. It's just,
there was a big brain drain from Russia. I mean, starting from the 90s, but even more recently. So a lot of these computer scientists and related professions did immigrate to the West. Of course, many of them went to the US and Canada. So it's not really surprising that there is that gap, right, between Russian development. But I think academically, Russia is probably one of the top countries to produce specialists in this field, as well as engineering and various applied type scientists. Well, of course, not just applied, theoretical as well, theoretical physics. So I think Russia has the potential to catch up. I mean, I'm not sure when and how this will happen, but the potential is definitely there.